What does it mean to have children? And how do we name our experience, both of ourselves and of the world? These are some of the questions I'm excited to explore with the visual artist, translator, and writer Ian Boyden in this conversation about the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, or in short, the Kural. I'm Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and for the last 5 years, give or take 17, I've been working on a translation of the Kural, which is a masterpiece of world literature easily on par with works such as the Tao Te Ching or the Bhagavad Gita or the poetry of Rumi, but which for a number of different reasons hasn't really made its way into English and into the world of people who read in English the way that some of these other texts have. And so I'm particularly excited to explore this work in the context, particularly with other poets and writers, as well as teachers and healers of all kinds, because this is a work that is very interested in how we bring wisdom into the nitty-gritty of daily life, into an embodied form. My guest today is Ian Boyden, as I've mentioned, who is an artist as well as a writer who has a deep interest in the materiality of our experience, in the ecological and geological and astronomical elements, cosmic elements of our experience. Just for one example, he has created his own paints and his own inks using meteorites, teeth from sharks, the remains of after a forest fire. So this very earthy element, a very tangible geologic element in Ian's work is very interesting to me because the Kural is also, and the poet of the Kural, Tiruvalluvar, is deeply interested in this very embodied experience of wisdom, very connected to the ground and to the earth sense of wisdom. So it's really a great pleasure that I get to welcome Ian here today. Thanks so much for being here.
Tom, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that introduction. It's always such a pleasure to hear how one is seen by contemporaries, and certainly a friend. So thank you.
Lovely. As I've been exploring this work with friends and with other poets and translators and healers, I found it a very fruitful and enjoyable exploration to look at a chapter that that I may have in common with my guest. And in this case, Ian recently came out with a book called A Forest of Names, which is a really extraordinary book of poems, which I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about at greater length. But it deals particularly with children, and it deals with the names of children who were who died in an accident, in a collapse of a building, and he explores the names of these children. This took place in China, and the names of these children, and has these beautiful poems about these children. And there is also in the Kural a chapter on what does it mean to have children. And so I thought that would be an interesting starting place, a point of departure. And so in fact, I will invite Ian to start there. However, I'll have to say that Ian has just decided to dive right into the whole work, and so I'll be very interested to see where the conversation may go from there. So at least just to get started, Ian, I'm curious of the 10 verses in the chapter on having children, and just as a side note, the Kural is a book which has 133 chapters, and each of these chapters deals with some particular aspect of life. There's a chapter on rain, a chapter on the right time to do something, the right place in which to do something. And in this case, what does it mean to bear children? What does it mean to have children? And so I'm curious, of the 10 short verses that comprise this chapter, is there a verse or a couple verses in particular that stood out to you?
Yeah, that's maybe not surprising given the introduction. The one that I gravitated toward most inside of that was number 64, which reads, "Sweeter than ambrosia by far, the food the tiny hands of one's children have scattered." And for me, that piece is, it's all about, it's about material, and it's about process, it's about delight. And this, I think that every parent who reads this will recognize that image. These moments when, your kid is just completely covered with, some sort of, food that you've placed in front of them, and it's all over the floor. And it's really impossible not to look at a moment like that and not just be completely overcome by love. And you can see yourself in it, and you know that at some point you might become a grandparent. You get to see it all over again. And so I really, I found myself reading that one again and again, not just because of the directness of the image. One of the things that I love about each one of these verses in the Tiro Kural is the directness and clarity of the image. That's a remarkable aspect of this book. There's almost not a single verse which is so abstract that you can't understand it. But in the directness of so many of the verses are things where you can read that in perhaps a really different way. And I think that when you have a child, one of the things that it becomes really worrisome is how you're going to protect that child. And how are you going to help it negotiate just the incredible labyrinth of disaster? This labyrinth is lined with all these potential calamities. How are you going to steward the immense promise of that child into the future? I mean, we're having children in some ways as a way of carrying ourselves, not just our genes and our genetics into the future, but also, aspects of humanity and cultural systems of one way or another, language and ecologies. You brought up ecology. That's a subject which is of great interest to me, and I think plays out in ways in this book that are really compelling. So looking at that, the food, the tiny hands that one's children have scattered, that food can very quickly become all these other things, right? Like we really are living in this world which is very, very scattered and shattered. Right now we're in the middle of a pandemic. So much of the structures which were holding everything together seamlessly, before, have just completely collapsed. I mean, here we are, we're having a conversation via Zoom, which really, took off because people couldn't be together in person. And so we're fragmented. We're both here on this, on my screen as these two little postage stamps of our faces, learning how to have conversation in a way that's actually quite distant from each other physically, but emotionally very close together. So in a sense, that's that kind of scattering. So when I read that image and I reread it, I kept thinking about that food as being kind of a symbol for all sorts of aspects of our world, and the cleaning of it up and the bringing of it back together. And is what's fallen edible any longer? If it fell on the floor, no way. But if it's on the tray, yeah, maybe we scoop it back up into the spoon and try again. Or if it's on the face, whatever, however that is. And how are we going to go about cleaning it up and including that kid inside of the cleaning of it? And what is that cleaning going to do to them, in a sense, right? So this, there's a lot packed into those few words that are in that, in line 64.
Well, that's so beautiful. This is one of my favorite verses, not just from this chapter, but from the work as a whole, because of this delightful imagery and invoking this idea of ambrosia, which is, this is the elixir of the gods. You eat this and you'll never die. That's the sort of implication. Sweeter than that.
Tamil is the elixir, is this an elixir of immortality or some sort of?
Amyrdam is this word for for this ambrosia, this
Okay.
or elixir or nectar, even sweeter than that, which of course makes the whole question of our mortality, brings it all the more to the fore. You're talking about this sense of how do we protect our children in a world which is often very dangerous, or
Yeah.
seems to be, or it actually is at sometimes very dangerous. Um, I just love how you bring all of those elements together. And something that's really remarkable for me about this verse is that this very short, less than 2 lines long verse also echoes back to people who know the classical Sangam literature is the term used for the great upwelling of Tamil literature, poetry, epics about 2,000 or so years ago. And there is in that, from that time period, and the Kural comes about 4th or 5th centuries. It's sort of late Sangam period for those who are interested in the chronology. There is a poem from that period which has the same image. And in fact,
Oh, really?
I want to share it because one of the great difficulties in translating a work, especially where of such compact verses, is that no matter how hard any of us may try, we can't get everything in there, especially all of the connotations that somebody reading the work in the original might have come to mind. And so I've done something which is actually quite similar to what is often done in Tamil, which is I've written a commentary. And it's a commentary of notes. So for not all of the verses, but for many of the verses, I include a note to give the reader a glimpse behind the scenes of a particular verse. So the connotations of elixir or nectar or ambrosia, depending on how it's been translated. But I also get to bring in poems that somebody reading the verse in Tamil might think of, oh, this is like that poem. So one of those poems comes from a poet named Pandian Arivode Nambi. And I'll share, and I put a translation of that poem in the commentary. And so I thought I'd share that. It goes like this. Even if he makes much and eats with many, owning great riches, if no children enter in, taking tiny steps, stretching little hands, throwing, touching, grabbing, smearing, spreading ghee rice all over their bodies, beguiling all sense, all a man's days mean nothing.
That's fantastic.
And I could even hear the echoes of that in what you were talking about how, what do we pass along? Not just, genetic information, but the whole, what do we pass along of our bodies and spirits through our children or through those things that are children, that are like children to us. And then here again is that same, the echo of that reflection, the echo of that meditation, if you will, about, without that, well, what does a person's days amount to at all?
There's something so particularly wonderful. I mean, I'm so glad you read that second poem, because of course, a propositional text like what you're reading is those are always written so that people will have conversations around them.
Yes.
Right. And so they're little fragments of wisdom which are placed, into our laps so that we can then begin to talk around them, and it begins to, open up like petal after petal after petal of a rose, or whatever image you want to use. And I think that when we look at food and we look at food culture with our children, it is such an amazing moment. It's like the birthplace, in my mind, it's almost like the birthplace of empathy. And you have this child and you want to get food into its mouth, and it might not really want that, right? It might not want. So you're like, well, now, and your face begins moving and you're like, you purse your lips, right? And you're like, you want to have something, and you're like, the whole face is like moving around like this fantastic, I don't know, you just go through all these different emotions. And it seems incredibly comical, but inside of your brain and inside the brain of this child are these mirror neurons, right? So these are what we call the empathy neurons. And that child there's no choice. After you start going ooh, like that, pretty soon its lips are like ooh, like that, and there's like this little cave that opens, and you take the moment, you quickly give it the applesauce, right? And so that is this incredibly sweet moment where you have achieved, right? You have actually achieved a linkage of brains. We have this really bizarre notion, this very mechanistic notion that our neurons end at our skin, right? And that there's between this and that is this unbridgeable gap that there's nothing can cross over. And yet anybody who spends time with a young child knows that that's perfectly nonsense, that it doesn't take all that much to create this moment of complete connection. And I think that we could even argue that at this moment, my neurons are somehow magically moving through the portal that we've opened up here and are touching you. And you're vice versa. There's something that's occurring here because I'm responding to your face and you're responding to mine and the tenor of my voice and all those types of things. And so that scattering of food, which is sweeter than all ambrosia, is not sweeter because the constituents of the carbohydrates that are in the grain of rice or whatever have anything to do with it. It has nothing to do with sweetness from a chemical standpoint, or nutritional standpoint. This is sweet because it is evidence of two minds that have suddenly touched each other and are conveying one to another. In the case of the parent, they're trying to pass on some sort of value and they're trying to take care of that. And for the kid, who knows, right? They're like, they get this chance to interact with this other being and they're like, wow, this is pretty intense, like they're learning the limitations, right? They're finding the joy at learning the limitless and limited aspects of their world.
That's so beautifully put. And as you speak, it makes me think of how, it reminds me of something you said just a little bit earlier about the discussions a person might have around these verses. So that for a parent and child, there's this delicious, delightful, messy experience of eyes and mouths and applesauce or whatever it may be, dribbling down onto the floor or onto somebody's dress or whatever it may be. And there's also this interesting way in which these little verses also have this kind of this capacity to nourish, and not just to nourish our own hearts, but also to nourish the meeting of hearts. So for us to be, using this verse or being used by this verse to enter into a different kind of connection, a different kind of shared exploration of hearts and minds, I think is so delightful. And in fact, there's a whole centuries and centuries old tradition of people discussing verses from this work and debating them with each other. And I've actually found myself, and I've known that, I've experienced that in the context of South India and Tamil Nadu, but also as I've been discussing these verses with friends of mine in English and in North America, I've been absolutely astonished and delighted by how it happens in English too, that we can connect over and through these ancient and new words, and to be reminded of things of our own experience, or to have aspects of our own experience mirrored back and forth between each other, which reshapes each other. It takes even the notion of there being an other and says maybe not so, maybe not so.
Yeah, I mean, I
maybe
think
not so defined.
When I read through this, there were certain pieces that I really latched onto that I really enjoyed because they were unusual. The language I thought was particularly beautiful. But one of the things that I noted was how actually very little of the book really felt like it was a complete stranger, like that, like the cultural paradigm of it was somehow of a completely other time and place, and was utterly foreign. It didn't do that to me. And that was really interesting. I mean, there are things which I object to in it, that to me are not cultural values that I have personally, and yet they didn't feel radicalized, I guess, in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the particular power of this text. I mean, that's very interesting.
That's very interesting too. I mean, I've had as a translator, my, the sense of responsibility, if you will, of wanting to convey the poems as the poems that I experience them to be, even if I may not agree with some of the ideas that they are resting upon or expressing. And yet there's also this overarching sense of the work being a friend, a companion, somebody that we can argue with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody
Mm-hmm.
we learn from and argue with and grow in relationship to. And that's another, I think, of the qualities that makes the work not only, very compelling, but also I think it's part of its very poetic nature, the conjoining nature or the integrating impulse, the synthetic, to use a fancy term,
Yeah.
qualities of relationality and so on. I'm curious, as you were reading through the work, if there were other verses in particular from this chapter, from anywhere really in the work that jumped out at you or that seemed to speak to something in you, even if you weren't exactly sure what it was speaking to in that moment.
Well, so we can move on to some of the other verses in other chapters, but before we leave this one,
Sure.
I think that there was the chapter was, hold on, I have to refer to it. It was number 66. Those who don't hear the babble of their children call the flute and the lyre sweet. And to me, that was, that's like another, it's like another statement, it's just like turning, the 64, just turning it 90 degrees or whatever, it's just, it's another facet of that. So this notion of sweetness and children, I think, is really driven home inside of those two pieces, and for me, that has always been a really compelling thing about being around children. And that is the way in which they really recalibrate what it is that we think of as important. I think it's really easy to become very self-obsessed. We become very driven in, a set of ideas that we might have. Our sense of self, begins to erase the world around us, as we enter into young adulthood, and that illusory sense of self really rises up like this demon. And it oftentimes really, it keeps us from being able to see the intergenerational nature of what our mind is and what we are composed of. And so it takes a lot to shake someone out of that. And I think this is part of the natural course of being human, right? Is we start off as this, sort of a complete singularity as a child. There's this incredible sweetness, pureness, presence, all the kind of catchphrases that people use to talk about that. And then something happens, and there are these walls that are constructed inside of us, and that we ourselves construct. It's through culture itself, through language, through our own hubris, through some sort of ambition. All these things begin to occur, and we want to somehow go out into the world and become successful. And we do all these different things. And there's something about that act which oftentimes results in othering. And one of the first things that I see is the distancing to children themselves. And I see a lot of parents who end up not being able to see their kids for their own ambitions. And when I read this text, I was like, wow, that's been going on for a lot longer than just 21st century America, which is my experience, right? We're looking at something which is as old as it probably means to be human. And this is a text inside there where they're really trying to drive that home, trying to remind you, you got to look at this, you know. And we have these moments in our lives where we're reminded of that. You know, I'm a parent, so I have this moment when my daughter was born that I think about all the time. You know, this being came kind of hurling into into my experience, and I had to learn how to be a father at that point. And they don't arrive with like textbooks that, you know, how-to manuals or anything like that. And so you have to really begin to try to assess that, learn how to do that. And I think that a text like this, which provides these propositions, and those propositions give us the opportunity to talk and to fill that out, are invaluable. Are there invaluable texts to really trying to help us, you know, learn how to be under those circumstances.
That's so beautifully put, and it's so lovely to hear your own experience of suddenly becoming a father. Here it is now. How does this look like? How does this go? And the ways that we discover that, the ways we can be guided in that, the way that there can be, you know, different cultural traditions, poetic traditions that have something to. It's not even that they have something to tell us, but it's almost like they have something to remind us of, or something to provoke a different kind of awareness, to provoke a different kind of attentiveness, which can break through that sense of separateness, or can break through the sort of veil that we may have in front of our eyes, that may keep us from seeing the person in front of us, whether it's a newly born being, a baby, a young child, or whether it's our husband, our wife, our parents. You know, how our vision does become so clouded by, or can become so clouded by, you know, our desires, our aspirations, our ambition, as you say. And I love about this verse, which is another of my very, very favorite verses in this entire work, how it brings to our attention the ear and the
Yeah,
capacity to hear. In fact, I'll share this verse in the in Tummer, so you can hear at least something
I love that.
of the
Yeah.
music of the verse. I'll do the verse. I'll do it in English and then Tummer and then English, just to sort of bring them together. Those who don't hear the babble of their children call the flute and the lyre sweet. Korlinide, yardinide yenba, dammakol marlaichol keeladavar. Those who don't hear the babble of their children call the flute and the lyre sweet. And I love that it's not just the words of one's children, but it's actually the word is the babbling. This is even before it even makes sense. It's the sort of discovery of sound, the reaching forward of the voice towards sound, or trying to make something of the sounds, to mirror, if you will, in an audible form, the sounds being heard in the air around. And I love how that there's this connection between that capacity to hear, that capacity to relish this very particular kind of sound, and a person's ability to appreciate the world. Of course, the lyre and the flute, these are sweet things, no doubt. But there's also this. There's also this, and all that this means, implies, resonates outwards and inwards at the same time.
As you said that, I was thinking very much of the name, you know, for Guanyin, you know, and you know, this a bodhisattva that is at very root going to be listening to sound. You know, that's what that that's what the name means in Chinese, a person who analyzes sound or contemplates sound, or by extension is listening to the cries and suffering. But that's not evident inside that. That's something that we're taught about that name. And I think that when we aren't listening to our children, we're really engaged in a form of violence. And people are often, they kind of forget that what we don't do is perhaps as important as what we are doing. So if we're not listening, if we're not teaching people how to listen to that babble and to cherish that, then we're actually engaging in a very profound form of violence. Because if we're not being heard, if we're not taking the time to listen and hear others, then everything has been cut off. We've literally come and we've snipped those neurons that we were just talking about, that reaching out and touching of one mind to another mind has simply just been cut, because we're not doing something incredibly simple, and that is just listening. Yeah. And in that work that I wrote that you mentioned at the beginning, A Forest of Names, one of the things that was of paramount interest to me inside of that was, could we use the actual names of these children to actually teach us to listen to them? And I think anybody who doesn't know a language, that language just sounds like babble. You just spoke a language that I don't know. And I was just kind of fascinated by the sound, and I had absolutely zero way of saying, oh, I bet that's the word, for liar. I don't know. And yet the moment that you begin to explain those things, right, and you begin to attach meaning to individual words, and we begin to understand their context culturally, or how they might be valued, then our heart opens up, and we begin to I think we begin to be able to hang things off of whatever that is, so that whatever it is that we begin to hang off of the armature of that thought and personalize it, then allows for us to then enter into it, right? So you were mentioning, for instance, the Ambrosia, and how important that was. When I read it, I'll be honest with you, I didn't really think about Ambrosia very much. And suddenly I'm thinking about turning the ocean to milk, and, giant, cosmic, soma-like drugs, and whoever knows, there's all those possibilities that are suddenly inside of there. I thought, oh, this day, maybe we're looking at a mind-altering moment. There's, you can see my mind just suddenly spun off there. But to me, that's the thing that's so important inside of these small propositional spaces, is that they help us align ourselves to what is important in our humanity. Yes. And what can we do to help people see those things? Because evidently it's not very easy to see. When we look out at the vast swath of our world, we can see how difficult it must truly be, with all the wars and the violence and everything else.
Somebody once said to me, a friend of mine in Tamil Nadu once said, the reason that these poets have had to write these works of wisdom is because people weren't doing it. they weren't necessarily upholding these ideals. Their very existence is evidence of the fact that we do need to be reminded, and we need to be reminded in ways that are unforgettable, that are deeply memorable, and that speak to not just our intellects, but to our whole being, that can touch our bodies, that can touch our neurons, that can reactivate our neurons in certain cases. I'm curious if there are any other verses, either in this chapter or in the work as a whole, that in this particular moment present themselves to you, or that you find relating to this territory we get to walk through together.
Well, yeah, I think there are a couple of verses that I really enjoyed, in which it was sort of an invitation to see ourselves in non-human animals.
Yes,
Section
from
called
knowing
knowing,
time, knowing the
yeah,
right
knowing
time to
time.
take an action.
Yeah.
I'll share the verse. It's the again, it's the 10th of these 10 verses, which each of these verses can stand on their own very easily, and also when they're in the first of those 10 positions, it often sort of suggests announcing a theme, and when it's in the last of those 10 positions, it sort of suggests maybe a summation or a turn toward the next chapter. And in this case, this 10th verse says, "Wait like the crane that waits,
Mm,
and strike like the crane when right."
right. So I really enjoyed that. I mean, I spend a lot of time. I'm a birder, so I love to go out and spend a lot of time observing my natural environment. And there's something so beautiful about this particular image of waiting and observing, and like, how do you convey, like, how do you teach someone to act at the right time and not to like jump forward? I mean, you see it happen. You'll see a crane or a heron or whatever it is, and they become impatient and they miss their mark. You see it. But most of the time, they're sitting there and they're so still and they're just moving slightly, and then that's it. And there's a transformation that occurs at that moment. A frog that was just singing is now suddenly going to, become a feast, and it's going to turn into a white feather of that crane, or it's going to provide that crane with enough energy to fly over to the next field or whatever. There's something that's going to happen. There's going to be, some sort of movement of energy across that field. And that's true that's just our life. That's what life is. And so trying to understand what that moment is when one needs to do it, right? It's not too early and it's not too late. I feel like we're just all stuck in this particular conundrum constantly. Like, do I do it now or do I not? Do I wait? So that was a wonderful one. See yourself in your environment. Understand that when you're watching that crane, you're also watching yourself. You're also seeing, you can see it as this something. I think a lot about of how I think that our identities are really, really closely caught up in time. And we have time and we have being and we have place as these three really massive tent stakes in understanding who we are. And so if you can find means and methods by which you can begin to understand time, then you're really coming to understand this, this sort of 1/3 of who you are. There's like this massive space. Like, how do you understand yourself of the time that you are? Not that you occupy, but that you are that time. As soon as you're disappeared, all your time is gone, right? And that time is no longer. So I think it's very worthwhile studying the time of those around you and the things around you, so that you can understand yourself.
I love that you mentioned time, this particular aspect of our being, our experience, because there's something interesting about this verse. Earlier, we were mentioning a verse, looking at a verse that recapitulated or took up a theme from several centuries before it and then played with it in its own way. There is another poem from a 12th century Tamar woman poet and saint named Abwayar, which takes this image of the crane and plays with it. And in fact, it's more interesting than that, because it's almost as if, although these poets are separated by probably 7 or 8 centuries, they are contemporaries. They are somehow in the same time, speaking with each other. And so this is one of the other poems that I happen to have put into the notes, the commentary at the back of the book. So I thought I'd share it. And this is how Abbayar sings in her own. This is a 4-line form, which is connected to, in fact, this 2-line form. There's a form in Tamar which has 3 full lines and then a 4th line which is about 5/8 feet long, more or less. And the form that Theravada uses in the Kural is those last 2 lines. The third, what would be the equivalent of the 3rd line, complete line, 4th incomplete line. So this is one that takes 3 complete lines and an incomplete line, just as a sort of metrical side note. And this is what she says. Don't think to conquer the one who holds back, concluding he must lack sense. Perched on the sluice gate, letting the running fish run, the white crane waits for the catch. And I love, in fact, this is a poem I learned in Tamar very, very early on. It was a poem that reawakened me to poetry with lines like letting the running fish run. Ordum min oda is the Tamar. And you may even be able to hear, letting the running fish run. We have this repetition of the word run. Ordum min oda. We have the repetition of the verb oda, ordum, to run. And that was, this is back when I was so entrenched in studying sort of philosophy and ideas from a very sort of intellectual or rational sort of standpoint that I had lost touch of the music of language. My capacity to listen to language as a presence, as a musical delight, had become diminished by the circumstances of my life and a number of other things. And then hearing that afresh and being reminded of this delightful musical property of not just this Tamar poet and the Tamar language, but of language. We can discover it everywhere. I came back to the States after that initial couple of years, and I could hear things I hadn't heard before, and that was really the initiation for me into my life as a poet and my work as a poet. But getting back to
the reintroduction into the U.S. or this poem that you just read?
Coming back to the U.S. after a couple of years of study, I could hear things. I mean, and it was, I learned it from being in Tamar and from living with a poem like this one. And that image also of the crane. I love this sense. And what Abbayar brings in of, it's not, the crane isn't just waiting for a fish to come. The fish are coming. And she lets them come and she lets them go because there's one that is the right one. There's the catch waiting for that. And of course, with that image of this fluidity, the fish moving in the water, when the catch comes, you can't wait. You can't be like, oh, I think that's it. I'll try now. It's gone.
Yeah. I mean, stillness, there's movement, and in movement, there's stillness.
Yes.
I mean, that's you can see that. I think that, when I read this book, I could really hear the music. I think that you really captured the music. And I think that you've also very much captured the philosophy. So it's really interesting to hear you. And I've talked about that, being blinded, to the music because of your interest in philosophy. As a reader, for me, as a reader of this book, I feel like you really captured both of those. One of the books that I ended up finding myself thinking about as I read this was Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And, they're very, very different books in most respects. But there's also this incredible similarity in that these are two poets or writers who are really interested in propositions and exploring propositions. I think Tiruvalluvar's interest is in humanity it's in this kind of the larger human paradigms and whatnot. And we have in Wittgenstein, obviously, a real fascination with language and meaning. And, it's very philosophical that way, obviously. But there's something so fascinating about propositions, because when you talk about something for a long time, people's attention span kind of vanishes, and we get lost. The human mind loves to get lost. It turns out that we're basically like, our minds just sort of constantly are creating these labyrinths that we wander off into, and we forget what the starting point was and why we might have even started writing. And we really enjoy it. There's something very, very beautiful about getting lost. But the power of a proposition is that it's so short that you don't have time to get lost. And if it's been written well, that means it's been written really clearly. And that clarity of that then allows for the content of it to take on this incredible amount of force, right? Every single one of these things could have been, he would have loved Twitter. He would have just been like, yeah, no problem. I got this one down. I can get every one of these things will fit here.
Yeah, you want 70 words, 140 words? I'll do it in 35.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll do it in 3.
Yeah. And so I'm really interested. I'd love to hear you talk about the idea of translating a proposition from one language into another. Wittgenstein talks about this idea that the proposition itself is not something which needs to be translated. It's the content. The proposition is somehow actually exists outside of language. I can argue with him about that, but that's a point that he makes inside of the Tractatus. It's very interesting to me, right? So he's interested in how do you translate the components of it so that it maintains the force of the proposition itself. So that proposition is somehow existing as a structure that's outside of that. So every language, theoretically, assuming it contains the constituent parts, should be able to hold a proposition from another language.
I love that you have brought Wittgenstein into our conversation, because interestingly enough, the year before I went to live in South India for the first of several extended stays, I was reading late Wittgenstein. So I was reading the Philosophical Investigations, and it really resonated with me, even though I was still very much sort of wrapped up in this kind of obsession with meaning, with a particular kind of philosophy, which is, obsessed with meaning and with clarity of thought and with clear statements and so on. And yet here was Wittgenstein talking about words not having meanings, in a sense, like it always means this, but that rather words inhabit what he called sort of language games, these contextual situations. So it's really a kind of ecology of language that he was exploring, how, in such and such circumstances, you use this word. But it's not simply like, oh, that's an apple, for instance. And so you say the word apple, you see the image of apple. It's this sort of identity of name and thing. But, what is that? How does that word inhabit in a context? You go to the store, you're buying some apples from the grocer. That's different. And so when I got to learning Tamil, I found myself realizing that it's not the case that you learn a language, because we never fully learn a language. I'm still learning English, for heaven's sakes, and continuing to study Tamil and Spanish and the languages within those languages that I'm learning. But what I discovered on the ground in my experience speaking with people is that you become fluent in contexts. Oh yeah, in this particular set of circumstances, one often says this, or they often say that. And this is part of the dance that we do together. And so I have to say, in addition to bringing in Wittgenstein, I'm also deeply grateful and deeply moved to hear you say that you found the translation to be musical, because I think of the various aspirations I had in carrying out the translation, that was one of the, if not the highest, that some playful, musical, rhythmic energetic quality of the language would be conveyed in the English. And in fact, for me, there, I graduated from college having studied philosophy and studied particularly moral philosophy and ethics. And then my encounter with Tummer really reminded me of a deep interest and passion and delight in language, which I think goes right back to my earliest experience as a baby, as a child with language. And so that's another 20 years of my life, sort of in my apprenticeship to poetry and to language, and to languages. And so I think that I get the gift of working on a book like this as a way to bring those elements together,
Mm.
that philosophical, particularly 20th century philosophical interest in the clarity of expression, with this other element, the element of the sensuality of language, the earthiness, those qualities that physically touch us, our senses, in our ears, in our bodies, as we pronounce, as we enunciate these statements, these words, these little musical utterances.
Mm.
And I think that there's something to me that's profoundly interesting, both as a poet and as a philosophically minded person, that they come together.
Mhm.
That in these short utterances, these short little almost snippets of song, if you will, we get a poetic and philosophical intelligence, an experience coming together in a way that we can look at the history of Western philosophy, and there's a great divide between poetry and philosophy. I mean, Plato himself kicks out from his ideal republic. He kicks out the poets,
Yeah.
even as he himself is writing at times, sometimes very poetically and powerfully. And there's, those of us who speak English, those of us who grew up in this sort of larger civilizational context, we also get to inherit that split. And then we get to look at ourselves and say, what does that do to my neurons?
Right.
What does that do to my ability to connect with my own child, with my own parents, with my lover, with my beloved? So that's sort of a long and rambling way of saying thank you for that observation. I'm really delighted to hear that, and I think that it's in many ways thanks to this particular poet and poetic tradition that I got to be reminded of that and to re-enter, to reintegrate those aspects of my experience, and hopefully through that will be useful as for other people who are doing on their own, not the same but similar journeys of how do we
Yeah.
bring all of these, how do we live a really human life, a human and humane life,
Yes.
in which we are able to harness the extraordinary powers of that the intellect and that rationality can offer us, without forgetting the sensual, the dark, the mysterious, the unsayable, what sometimes we find ourselves able to suggest or say.
Gorgeous. I love it. I think that you've done such a beautiful job um, capturing that inside of this translation. I think it's an incredible moment in the history of the translation of this text. I mean, I'm not a Kural scholar, so I can't make a definitive statement that way, but it really works. And the you know I think that your desire to bring the music into it is something which I trust completely, having listened to you just now. I think that so often our intellectual tradition in this country is really, it's very suspicious of integrative type of minds. And this is really part of, the Cascadia tradition. I mean, there's like all these poets who are also painters, who are also garden designers, who are translators, like they're just like nobody's content to be siloed over in this one field. And I see that in you. I see that very much inside of your practice. It's an incredible plurality to your practice. So and it takes a long time. I think it takes an incredibly long time to arrive at a place where where you don't have a hierarchy of importance, of one over the other. I mean, it's very easy to say the philosopher is much more important than the bard, in our current, cultural paradigm. And then you overcome that. I think that's amazing. It's like this notion that somehow humor and intelligence don't mix. And and yet we all know that that's complete nonsense. So I think there's something really beautiful there that you've accomplished that way. So
Well, thank you very much for saying that, and thank you also very much for saying yes to my invitation to this conversation.
Yeah.
I love where we ended up, which of course is not anywhere I could have imagined, and I've learned that I don't know where these things will go.
There's a part of this book that I absolutely loved. I think that when we think about how we construct, a massive book, this is a big tome and it covers kind of all facets. And as I was reading, I was like, gosh, how is this book going to end? Like, what grand note is he going to go out on? And I was waiting because I didn't want to spoil it, and then we get to this part where suddenly it's so flirtatious. The ending is so incredibly flirtatious. Do you want me to spoil the ending at all, or
I think it's totally fine, because I love.
Okay, so what is it? What goes on with the sulking, right? Like, I feel that if I were to be your ideal guest at the moment, I would start to sulk a little bit. I don't know. I don't feel like you actually have honored me enough yet. I don't know what I would do. I loved this, it was this advice, this incredible advice at the end, even if he's done everything right, you should still sulk a little bit, and that there was some sort of inside of this lover spat, that's in those last few pages. I began to see myself, I began to identify very much with the female voice in there, and that I was really this reader who was, my lover was the poet, right? And that at this point, it's coming to an end, and how am I going to draw this book out a little bit longer, or some sort of thing like that. I don't know. Can you comment on this?
I love that.
It really was a surprise to me.
I love it. I love it. It's been a surprise to a lot of people. In fact, the whole third part of the book has been a surprise to certain kinds of sensibilities. For instance, many of the first translations that were made into Western languages just cut out the whole third book on love, which is on this sort of the ins and outs of longing, desire, the sort of love which is secret even to the lovers, or seemingly secret, and then the ins and outs of committed relationships. And so, people have argued, oh, well, it's a different poet. I mean, it feels like such a different register. But some of my favorite verses come from this last bit. And for this book to end on not just one, but 3 chapters on sulking. We have 130, we have sulking. Then we have sulking subtleties. And then we have sulking and bliss. And for those, listening who haven't yet had a chance to read the book or are unfamiliar with the work, this sulking has to do with how these lovers, these people who are in it for the long haul, how these little misunderstandings come up, little jealousies, seemingly little jealousies, and then one or the other, they turn away. I think anybody who's been in a long-term relationship knows what this feels like. There's the turning away, there's the sulking, right? And then there's this possibility of turning back again. That we might say, okay, I guess that was a stupid thing to say. Or, in fact, in that moment, what you said reminded me of this other thing, which had nothing to do with you. Whatever it may be. And the implication is that this turning back is a sweetness beyond compare. That this is part of our human experience, because it's very easy in a kind of idealized, vision like, you know, a good person's going to be good all the time and good in every way, and they're never going to argue with their husband or wife, and they're going to be, you know, XYZ version of perfection. And here, this is like, you know, that's not how it is. You know, if you're in a long committed relationship, you're going to have misunderstandings, you're going to have jealousies, you're going to have stuff come up. And in some ways, that's what's supposed to happen, because we're supposed to have this turning away, because then it offers this sweetness of coming back again more fully, more humbly, with more of our arrogance stripped away, more of our inability to connect with the other stripped away. So the last verse of the whole book begins, it goes like this: sulking in love is joy, and joining again, joy of joys. That we celebrate sulking because it brings us back again. It's
Yeah.
that alchemical element, if you will, that brings us back to the deepest gold of our experience. And I love that this work, which is sometimes so sort of very practical and very interested in matters of governance and of how of households work and the relationships of friends and all of these things, also has what I think is a very profound understanding of these very subtle and powerful energies that are awakened in us, whether it's in a couple, whether it's in our relationship with a book, with a poet,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
a work of art we may ourselves be creating, and we may, you know, we come in and it doesn't look right, and we may sulk, or the work may be sulking.
No,
And
it's
it's
so
so part
so
of it.
beautiful, because I've always thought about sulking very much, as, I don't know, on the sort of a personal level, and it makes me wonder today if we haven't somehow on a larger cultural, level, have forgotten the importance of turning back,
Yes.
and that we've entered into an age in which we're really perfecting the turning away from each other, and that a lot of our technologies, our social media platforms, the news media, whatever it is, as it vies for attention, and it's really being driven by division. We really see the divisive nature of money inside of these platforms. If we haven't somehow forgotten the importance of sulking for the beauty of being able to turn back, rather than as something which becomes an expression of dominance, and humiliation.
Yeah.
Because when a lover sulks and you turn back, it's never about humiliation, but about reminding us that we need to see each other.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that all of us could practice.
Yeah. And that there's a music to that, that there's the rhythm of it, the sulking and the returning, that both are necessary, but we can get totally out of balance, clearly. But of course, the antidote is not, you know, jettison the sulking and pretend it doesn't exist. That's probably the opposite of how such a dynamic becomes healed. But how do we acknowledge that and then have the vulnerability to turn back, not even knowing, are we going to be received again? Are we going to be seen in our effort to see? And I think that's really, really beautifully put. And it's perhaps, I think we could go on for a lot. I could imagine all sorts of other places we could travel together. But
we can bring it to a close. I just think that what you've done is beautiful.
well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your taking the time to converse with me here. And for those watching or listening, if you want to learn more about Ian's work, see it and read it and listen to it, you can visit his website, ianboyden.com. I'll put up a link in the information that goes along with this video, and it's really been a great pleasure. Thank you for your presence, and thank you for what you've said and shared with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. It's just a great pleasure.